Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Hanya Yanagihara and Andy Kahan.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Hanya, for joining us. I have a question for the audience first, or maybe a few questions. How many of you have read the book? Wow. How many of you haven't read the book? 3. Okay. Well, I think we'll still have to
We won't spoil, right?
guard our answers.
Yeah.
Yeah, or you'll guard your answers.
I'll guard
my questions.
So it'll be Andy's fault if it gets spoiled for those of you
I'll
who
take the blame.
Yeah.
How many of you, while reading this book, had to put it down? You were so upset. How many of you actually despaired for some of the characters? How many of you cried? How many of you sobbed? I hope you're happy.
Well, I feel this is a mic drop moment, and now I can leave. By the way, I should tell you that the one piece of advice Andy gave me as we were coming out, he's like, listen, this is a First Amendment shop, so you can say whatever you want. If you want to swear, go for it. You know, if you just say whatever you want. And I said, so I can get in trouble on Twitter lately? And he's like, if that's what you need to do, then just do it.
So we'll see what ends up out there.
Yeah, so he's spoiling for trouble.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, I
So
know.
you were a publicist at Random House, right?
Yes, I started off at Ballantine, which is a mass market publisher in sales, and then I was at Vintage, which is now the house that's publishing me as a publicity assistant, and then I went to a house called Riverhead, and I was an editorial assistant, and I was awful at all 3 of the jobs. You know,
It's hard to believe.
No, I really was. I mean, there's people who are good at book publishing, and I wasn't one of them, and it was heartbreaking to realize I wasn't one of them. And so in '99, I left and I went into magazines.
Glad you made the switch.
I was, you know, it's just a very different pace. I mean, book publishing at the time, I think it's slightly more democratic now, although not more diverse, but it's traditionally been sort of a more snobbish, more clannish kind of industry. And magazines really tolerate and to some extent encourage zaniness. You know, it is, I mean, I do liken being in a magazine to everyone you didn't want to talk to in high school is sort of stuck together working on this thing together, you know. So you have the fashion department who would have been kind of the theater kids or the kind of goth kids, and you have the editors who would have been the speech and debate team, and you have the sales team, which would have been the sports team, and you have the art department, which would have been the people in the trench coats, and everyone's really forced to work together in this small tribe. And and so there are these sort of strange, unlikely friendships with kinds of people you wouldn't encounter anywhere else. And in books, it tends to be more of a similar personality sort of across the departments. So it felt like a homecoming to go into magazines and realize that that there were just lots of misfits, and the pace is much faster too.
Keeps your mind sharp.
I wouldn't say that, but it but it does mean that you become any good magazine editor is a generalist, much like any good book editor. But unlike a book editor who is waiting for an author to turn in a project every 2, 3, 5, 10 years, for magazine editors, you're working with that writer constantly, and magazine writers tend to respond well to editing. This is why I'm not a magazine editor, and they tend to work with you much more closely. So it's a real relationship that develops over years, and it's much more collaborative. And I really like that. It's much less artificial somehow.
And you're the deputy editor at T Magazine, so you're one of those editors who's always assigning projects to people.
Yes. Yes, but and it is nice because book editors these days have to think so much about marketing a book and how it's going to make money and P&Ls, and for better and for worse, magazine editors don't. We still don't have to think about a story in quantifiable terms, which feels like a disappearing luxury, but still exists.
Well, that's up to the ad department, I guess, to figure that stuff out.
Yeah, and the online department. Yeah.
So say you're at Random House and Sunny Maida comes up and drops this on your desk.
Yeah.
And says, what do you think of that cover? What would you say?
Well, Sunny, apparently, this actually did happen. They presented this cover to Sunny, who's the legendary editor of Knopf, and he was fine with it.
He was.
But there was a lot of sort of hand-wringing about what would Sunny think and what would Sunny do. And, you know, the story of this cover is, in a way, a story of how a book gets published because, you know, writers have very little control over over your cover. So when you see a book with this goofy cover and you think, what was the author thinking? The author probably had no say. You get right of consultation, which means basically they always say this, they say, you go out to lunch and they say, here's your cover. And they slide something across the table for you face down, and you turn it over, and it's awful. It's like a woman's face with, it's the typical kind of cover. And that's what happened with this. And I really chose to fight for this particular image, which is by an artist named Peter Hujar, and it's called Orgasmic Man. Should I work into the blue territory, Andy? No.
Go for it.
And the picture was taken in 1969, and is just a gorgeous print. I mean, if you look at it on the side, this is the full-length version. This is a crop. And what I was so drawn to with this cover was that you didn't know whether the man in it was whether in pleasure or in pain, but you did know that you were trespassing upon someone in one of their most vulnerable moments, and that there was a visceral quality to this person's expression. And I thought in that way it was a good depiction of what I wanted the book to actually do to the reader as well. And so I really did fight for it very hard. And they still don't like it. I ran into the publisher about 6 months ago, and I said, aren't you really excited that the cover's working? And he said, the cover's fucking horrible. The booksellers hate it. The sales reps hate it. The libraries hate it. They all hate it. And I said, well, I don't think that's true, Bill. And he said, it's so fucking horrible, it's become iconic. But then when the paperback came up, they tried to make me change it again. And so every step of the way they've tried to make me change it, but then they haven't been able to do anything.
What did they want it to be originally?
They originally had proposed this actually very beautiful photograph by an artist named John Dugdale, who is about 10 years younger than Hujar, and does cyanotypes, which is an old 19th century form of photography where you get a blue tint, on the photo. And he started making these photos after he's blind. So he started going blind from an AIDS-related illness when he was still a young man. And it was a series of photos based on Emily Dickinson's poems. And the one they used was based on, God, I can't remember the one, but I heard a fly pass when I died. I think it's that one. It's a beautiful, beautiful image. It's of a man lying on a sofa. And I objected to it because it felt very inert. It's a very pretty image, but it feels like it's only about death. And I didn't think that's what this book was about. And I also didn't think Jude would have a sofa like that. I mean, I think it's hard not to look at a book cover, especially one that's so character-driven, a book that's so character-driven, and not think, this is the character. And I thought that book was the image was too specific. So mostly they didn't really have any other ideas. They just didn't want me to use this one.
Did they take the cyano type idea and
yeah,
and
they
apply
did,
it to this so
it's
that
really
they got
goofy.
their little...
Yeah, they did get their dig in. It's really goofy. I hate it. And that's why it's not on the paperback.
The paperback's all gray.
Yeah.
Well, continuing on this theme of images, I've read that you wrote the book with some very specific images in mind.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk about who some of those artists were and how they guided your novel. Yeah.
Sure.
Exactly.
I mean, authors use, and for any of you who are writers, you know that inspiration comes in different ways and from different things, and sometimes it's music, sometimes it's other books. For me in particular, it was contemporary art and contemporary photography, which I've been collecting for a while. And so even before I started writing this book, I had a collection of images, that I hadn't really realized were united in any sort of way until I started writing. And I turned to these images as a sort of, tonal mood board to see, is what I'm seeing in this image being expressed in the tone and the mood of this book? One of the most important was a piece by Deanne Arbus called The Backwards Man in His Hotel Room, which is an early piece of hers from 1961, before she moved to her square format. And it's of a man who is a contortionist, probably. He's standing in a bare hotel room with a dangling light bulb, and his feet are pointing one way and his head is pointing another. And it was just I remember seeing this in maybe 2004, right before her big retrospective went up called Revelations, and thinking that it was such a perfect picture of loneliness, and that I was going to write text to accompany that image. And so in many ways, this book is a response to that photo. And I also looked at work by artists who really are able to depict young people and how at ease they feel in their body. So Felix Sid, who's a young photographer, Ryan McGinley, I looked at his work a lot. And then finally there was a series that some of you will know by an artist named Nicholas Nixon, who's a photographer, called The Brown Sisters. And for The Brown Sisters, Nixon has shot his wife, Bibi, and her 3 sisters lined up in the same order for every year for the past 40 years, 41 years now. And they're just beautiful pictures separately, but together they say so much about the awesomeness of aging and the sorrow of aging and the beauty of aging. And in an earlier iteration of this book, JB was going to be a photographer, and he was going to basically rip off that exact same series. But I, in the end, I didn't do it because I didn't think that Jude would tolerate that much photography being taken of him. And also, you know, one of the things that's tricky about being a writer and trying to imagine a visual artist's world is that because you can't think that way, you're constantly stealing. And I stole a lot for JB's projects for this book, but it just seemed too direct of a theft, and I didn't do it.
The images are remarkable, the ones that you've referred to, and they sort of, particularly the Nixon
The
images.
Nixon, yeah.
And they sort of, there is something thematic there with your book in that the shift over time, but that it's also isolated in
Yes.
time. You just see these characters, you don't know, you have no idea what's going on in the world around them.
Right.
And that's sort of a quality that comes through in the writing, at least that perhaps you picked up from the
Well,
war.
you know,
or
I'm glad you
dialogue.
said that. And one of the things I argue with my editor about was he said, well, why does JB, who's the artist in the book, keep using his friends as subjects and material? And I remember he wrote, he needs to get a life. But the fact is, you know, many visual artists in particular use the same group of people again and again and again, and documenting these people's lives is the stuff of an entire artistic career. I mean, that's true of Nan Goldin, that's true of Nixon in a lot of ways.
Sally
It's
Mann.
true. Yeah, it's true of many, many artists, and they find a sort of tribe, and they stay with that tribe for their entire artistic careers.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, this book was, I suppose, subconsciously an homage to that sort of practice.
I wonder if you could talk about the writing of the book. You're a writer, or among writers, I am
Yeah.
sure. You described it as an 18-month fever dream, but you also described it as being dangerous in some way, and I wonder if you can elaborate on that.
Well, you know, I mean, I wrote this book very fast. My first book took many years. For any of you who are writing books or struggling to finish a first book, the second book is in some ways easier because you know you can do it, you know, and you know what your own sort of pitfalls are, and you know where your own weaknesses are. You're just better prepared to fight against your own worst instincts. And so in that sense, I felt I was going into it better armed. But it is a book that obviously exacts an emotional toll. And I was lucky because I had a day job, and so for, you know, X number of hours a day, I was lifted out of the world of this book and into the job. But, you know, in order to write a book like this, where the characters feel really truer to you than your own, you know, friends, your own humans, it does demand an act of submergence. You know, it does demand that you really start trying as much as possible to forget about the everyday world, the quotidian world. And I do understand, I always thought it was sort of pretentious claptrap, but you do really understand when artists say that they start losing themselves in the work. You understand what that means, because it's something you hope for, that sense of immersion. And it's something that when it happens, you know you're doing something right. You don't know to what ends necessarily. But it does mean that you as the creator cede a certain amount of control, that the creature no longer is yours. I mean, it is, you know, akin to creating a golem, and the golem staggers off, and after a certain point you can't chase after it anymore.
So it becomes a monster.
Yeah, it becomes a monster.
But it was never anything that you felt so enthralled to that it was actually damaging to your emotional.
Well, not in the
stance.
moment, but, you know, but probably. I mean, I had one companion, my reader, and I didn't show it to my editor, I didn't show it to my agent, so it was a very isolating experience. And so there were times when I was lucky to have him so I could talk about the life of the book, and it was a life he really understood, and he really understood what it was taking out of me and where I needed to go in order to get to make the book feel true. But I think it's more that the after effects of the book have been more profound than I imagined. You know, I think when any of us finish a creative project, you think, well, I'm done, I'm ready to exit this world and move on to something else. But it doesn't work that way. You know, if you've submerged yourself as deeply as you should have, it should, you know, have its something should be pulling you back for some time. And for me, the sort of unwelcome surprise has been how long I've remained in the life of this book.
Are you ready to be done with it?
Yeah.
And move on to whatever's next?
Yes, I mean, I'll miss it. You know, I mean, part of the reason I've stayed in it is because I wanted to stay in it, but and the reality of promoting it and so on is demand that I stay in it. But it, you know, one can't live in a created world forever.
For the 3 people who haven't read the book, don't be embarrassed. Can you give a brief précis, a little narrative arc, so that we can sort of continue on talking about some of the
So the book is about, well, everyone started it, right? Okay, you haven't started it. All right. So the book is about 4 friends who come to New York after grad school, and it follows them over a period of about 30 years. And one of the things I wanted to do with this book was sort of fool the reader into thinking it was a fairly standard New York post-collegiate book, and then by the end of the first section you realize it's not, that it's something else. And then as you move deeper into the second and third section, you realize it's something altogether different than what you had thought. But it is, I did want it to be narratively driven. I mean, I like a book without a narrative as much as anyone, but I did want it to have a plot, and it is about in an exaggerated sense what happens to these 4 male friends.
I want to circle around. We'll get back to the exaggerated sense in a moment. But I wonder if you could talk about, just to circle back to your reader, what did he bring to it? And what was, maybe even before that, what was the structure of what you initially had, and how did you shift to create the plot that we read?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I knew I wanted to create a character, as I've said before in interviews, who never gets better. And this idea of having someone who didn't move from here to here, but stayed here, went all around, and ended up back here. And if a character never gets better, what's the sort of tension of the book? You know, what's the propulsion of the book? What's the suspense of the book? And so I had originally conceived of the book as a series of 2 novellas followed by a coda. And the first novella would be all of the characters as they appear here, and Jude, the main character, in a life very much like the one he inhabits, sort of high-functioning and high-performing, who is successful but falling apart. The second novella would be about him, but as sort of a marginal figure, and it would be first person. And it was going to be about someone who really, because of bad luck, you know, and that's often the difference between people who seem to live well with trauma and people who don't. It's luck. And so it would be someone who was really sort of living at the margins of society. And all of the characters' names would appear, but they would have different guises. One of them would be his drug counselor, one of them would be his social worker, and he would be temperamentally very different. And then the third part, the coda, would be about what had happened to him as a child. And I didn't do that mostly because it felt too gimmicky. It felt like the structure of the book would have been the story rather than the story being the story. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to explore this idea of why are some people able to apparently overcome what's happened to them, and some people are apparently not. You know, is there a sort of special tool or a gift that enables that, or is it simply a matter of fortune? And in the end, I just felt it was too rigid of a structure. So once I started writing, and for any of you who are writers, you know that the most difficult thing is starting, because before you start, the book can be anything. Once you start eliminating possibilities. You know, you start eliminating narrative possibilities, you start eliminating people, you start eliminating so much ends up on the cutting room floor before you even write it. And that's a kind of a heartbreaking thing to do, and it's why so many people are reluctant to begin, or at least I am. And so I really tried to mathematically structure the book as a symphony. You know, it's 7 parts, it's 3 parts within each part, it's 3 subsections mostly within each of those subparts. And so I wanted the reader, even if they didn't recognize that, to sense that there was a strong foundation and a really strong girding. You know, I thought of when you go to China and they have scaffolding outside of buildings, and it's all made of really neat and organized bamboo steps. And I wanted the reader to feel that beneath them. And then on top of that structure, I wanted to load everything else, excess and melodrama and so on and so forth. But I wanted it to be mathematical in its structure. So what would happen is I would write a section, a complete, what is referred to in the book as a 1, 2, 3. And then I would send it to my reader. He would read it and write back with immediate responses. I would send him an email with about 10 to 12 questions, some of which were very granular and some of which were larger and thematic. He would answer those. I would send him a second round of those questions. He would answer those. And then every Friday, we see each other and we talked about the book. So it was a terrific amount of time and attention and care from him. And the book, it really is his in a lot of ways as well. I mean, so many of my ways about thinking about friendship and love came from conversations with him, and were nudged in different directions by what he believes and what he was able to express. And because he's a very good editor, and people can be good editors in lots of ways, but he's a good editor in the way that, he could spot poor grammar. He could pick out, words that weren't as felicitous as they needed to be. He could pick out when the pace was moving a little too fast or too slow. And he could also pick out what I was not able to really identify or articulate for myself. And the example that's my favorite is that there's a part in section 4 where Jude is in a disastrous first relationship as an adult, and he starts imagining that these hyenas are chasing him constantly. And my reader, Jared, said, "I think the hyenas are sex." And until he said that, I hadn't realized that that's what it was, but he was completely right. That's what the hyenas are to Jude. That's what they represent. And so a good editor is able to often, of course, point out the weak parts of your book to you and the flaws in logic and so on and so forth, but they're also able to alert you to what you're trying to say but don't quite recognize you're trying to say.
And was he part of that 18-month process, or is this ex post facto? It's the 18-month process.
It's 18 months, yeah.
And then you're turning it into Random House, and they're saying,
yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Well, they didn't say that, but yeah.
Let me just jump around here a bit. Let's move on to the research portion of our discussion.
Yeah.
You seem to be conversant in so many topics, from case law to the arts to mathematics to the psychology of trauma, sexual habits of gay, bi, and straight men. Would you talk a bit about the research for the book?
Well, I mean, the great thing, again, for those of you who are writers, and this is really true, we're a non-reading culture, and yet people are terrifically respectful of people who do read, or who write, I should say. And so you can really call up anyone, and I mean anyone, and say, "I'm a novelist, I'm trying to write something, I'd like to talk to you about your job," and they will say yes. It's amazing. I mean, I was so apologetic when I started, and then I realized that people are just sort of happy to talk about their daily lives with you, and they do so wonderfully, and people are wonderful explainers. And over the course of researching this book, I got to talk to a lot of people about their jobs, and people tend to be very articulate about their jobs. And so I did the most amount of research for Jude. I talked to a law student, I talked to someone who was clerking, I talked to someone who was at the U.S. Attorney General's office, I talked to 3 litigators, and I talked to a litigator who's becoming a law professor at Rutgers. And then after I did all that, after the book was done, the manuscript was done, I sent it back to this litigator turned law professor, and he read through everything and marked up everything that he thought, was a little bit wrong or unbelievable. And, I told him it doesn't have to be typical, it just has to be plausible. Mm-hmm. So I really made sure I knew what Jude was doing at every step of his career, and more importantly, how his mind worked. Because if you talk to litigators, they do think in a very particular way. They see the world through a very particular lens. And the math part was from a friend of mine who was a pure math major at MIT. I can't take credit for the stuff about math. It's almost verbatim what he told me. And then the others, I talked to a friend who worked at a Starkitect's office. He worked at Rem Koolhaas's office. And then had set up a firm of his own. And I have a very good friend who's a gallerist, so I talked to him about JB. And I mostly talk to people behind the scenes for Willem, all of whom hate actors, by the way. So, I talked to mine who was a DP, and I talked to friends who worked in various backstage theater directors. So it was wonderful. I mean, it was a part of the book I was dreading, and in fact, I had to stop writing after a certain point because I knew that certain things would be affected by career, and I needed to make sure I was going down the right track. But it actually turned out to be the best part of writing this book in a lot of ways, was conducting these interviews.
And what about the abuse aspects and the sexual trauma and the cutting and things of that nature?
I didn't do any research for that because I think that there's a sort of logic. What happens to how Jude reacts to what happens to him just felt very natural. I mean, it felt like something that, when we think about the language of trauma, or how people experience or externalize trauma, it tends to be the same way again and again and again. And not because every experience isn't distinct and unique, but much like how we mourn in a similar way, we try to answer things that have happened to us that are beyond our control with in very limited ways, because it's all we have access to. So I wanted him to be someone who struggles in a lot of ways, and so does Willem, with this sense of not having enough, and I don't mean this is something that's his fault, but having the sort of bigness of imagination, the sort of audacity of imagination to conjure a different sort of life for himself. And much of this book is spent with Jude's struggle of trying to unlearn what he's been taught, and also with trying to think that life might not be as he's been taught it is.
Yeah, other people have to imagine what could be good in his
for
life
him.
For
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
And he sort of passes that on to Felix toward the beginning of the book, the student that he's teaching. It's like, you don't want people who are cool. You want people who are more generous, who are more loving, who are more friendly than you are.
Right. And one of the things I did really want to give Jude was someone who really hadn't had the ability to love kicked out of him, who remains human and hopeful, and because he still retains that gift, even against all sort of odds.
He retains it against amazing odds, and odds that, I mean, they're harrowing to read, as I'm sure all of you know. And that's part of the thing that draws us into it as well, is this back and forth between how harrowing things are and how much you love this guy, and that little kernel of hope that keeps going on in him despite every conceivable horrible setback. And as a reader, and I'm sure you've probably had this question a lot, I felt that my expectations were being reeled in. You would drop a little hint, and then something happens. A hint, something happens, and it's constantly happening. And there's this almost prurience I felt as a reader, wanting to know what the next awful thing was, and just sort of waiting for that to happen to him. It was like car crash after car crash after car crash.
Right.
And I just felt like I was contributing to it by being someone who was reading it in a way. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I do know what you mean. But I do think that's how many people who have lived through trauma experience life. It's one of the things I wanted to do in this book was, often in a single paragraph, the tense will shift from past to present. Because I think when you do live with trauma, it's not like you can say, all right, well, this is the past, I'm putting it behind me, I'm moving on, this is my life now. It simply doesn't work like that. You are living with the past every single day, and you are trying to answer and trying to accommodate it in your life. And my friend had said, my reader had said that he called it two things. He called it an emotional thriller, which I thought was actually an interesting way of putting it. And he had also said that Jude was in a perpetual state of emergency. And I thought that was a genius way of putting it, actually, because I think that is how it feels for people, for many of us who really feel that we have to accommodate our past into our life, that our past is not something that we can control. It's not something that is ours even, really. It's something that we don't know how to answer, and we don't know how to fold into our present day. And so I think that, for the reader, I wanted the reader to feel like Jude feels every day. What's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? I know that fate has taught me that something's going to happen to me next, and what's it going to be? And unfortunately, if that's the way you've been raised to see the world, because that's what the world's taught you, it does keep happening again and again. You know, I mean, one of the things I was telling my editor is that I think there are people who, once they've been taught, once they've learned that people will always hurt them, are always going to gravitate towards people who hurt them. And they can't help it. You know, it's a moth to the flame sort of situation.
They think they deserve it, as Jude does.
And it's familiar, you know. And then there are also people who can sense that about other people, who can sense damage on people, who can sense who makes easy prey, who can sense who's going to be vulnerable to them. And it's you know, it is like every human relationship, a complicated one, and that is a tremendously difficult pattern to break.
That's one of the virtues of the book, is how keen and wise that interplay of the relationships is between the boys, let's call them, and it's complex, and yet it's accessible, and it's just constantly got us reading along.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean,
yeah,
I did really want to have a clip, you know.
The clip's there. It's definitely an emotional thriller. The cutting, though, I want to come back to that, because it's just something you don't see, you rarely see it outside of YA Lit. And when it's in YA Lit, young adult literature, it explodes. I mean, not so much anymore. There was a book called Scar that came out that just lit up the inner tubes, and big fight between various outlets about it. And self-harm is just not something you see very much in contemporary literature. I can only think of, I read a lot of books, but not that many. But I can only think of one or two for adults where I've seen it. I mean, was that something you really, you didn't think, oh, this is missing in contemporary literature?
No, I mean, no, I didn't step in to heroically fill that void.
Yeah.
I mean, I did think that it was something that, you know, it felt very natural to how the character would react. He has very few coping mechanisms, and all Jude really has is that bag filled with razors. I mean, it really is what stands between him and his past, is that. And I just felt it was heartbreaking in its flimsiness, that this is the only thing he has, and this is the only way he has to control his body, and it's the only way he has to announce to himself that he owns it. And, you know, I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking about this. I was at the Barnes Foundation today, and I was thinking about the speech I have to give next month about the relationship between the reader and the writer, and is there one, first of all, and is there too much for a reader to handle? And when we look back at the history of visual art has been unsparing in what it's shown us about violence, about what man can do to another man, you know, from Goya to Matthew Brady to Nan Goldin to, there's this photographer whose name I can't remember now, who is this Japanese photographer who actually does show pictures of cutting. She cuts herself, and they're documentations again and again and again. And we do see images. We are used to seeing images, and we're used to seeing them on TV, we're used to seeing them in newspapers, and we're used to seeing them in art, as it should be, of the extremes of human behavior and what humans can do to one another. And literature should be no different. You know, the visceral quality of reading about harm, about brutality. You know, for me, for this book, I don't understand why it's not appropriate for fiction, but it is for other genres. And for me, you know, I really wanted the reader to be there as a witness for Jude. You know, I was talking to my editor, and he was saying, well, it's too violent, it's too brutal. And first of all, I don't think that you get anywhere trying to guess at what a reader can take and what a reader can withstand, because it's so condescending. A reader can take anything. A reader only wants, I mean, I'm speaking for myself, you know, a fully formed, logical universe that feels complete and authoritative and confident. That's what I want in fiction. And beyond that, I mean, I don't think there are any other rules. If the author can fulfill it completely and without flinching, then I think then the reader either chooses to go along or doesn't. But one of the reasons that the cutting was so important to me, and the repetitiveness of the cutting, is because this is how this character would react. And there was a sense, and this is where the sort of book started shading into something, I suppose, more than a book, this idea that there are times in this narrative in which the reader knows more than the other characters, and there are times in which the other characters know more than the reader. And then there are times when Jude has no one in his life but the reader, and you, the reader, are there to witness him at the very worst moments of his life. And that is true for us in life with other humans, and it ought to be true of us in art as well.
I get so sucked into what you're saying, I'm completely lost with my questions. I'm sure that's a sign. Yeah, it is. All right, well, I'll skip the other 20. Why don't we move to the Q&A now?
Well, first, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
It's phenomenal.
Thank you so much.
It's also been very successful. I want to ask you about success with the characters. You sort of alluded to it slightly in your chat right now. The four main men are all very successful in their careers, and some of them have less successful personal lives. And I'm curious what went into that decision, because I kept sort of waiting for Jude to have a problem with a case, or for Willem to have a bad, film experience, or Jamie
Right.
does have a so-so art opening,
Right.
but that's like the worst thing that happens,
Right.
because their personal lives are so.
Right.
Can you talk about the balance of the characters? Because I think the way they sort of knit together is really interesting in terms of the quartet, but also in terms of personal versus professional life.
That's a great question. I mean, one of the ways I call this a New York novel, and it's not a New York novel because it's not about 9/11. It's not about the Second Gilded Age. It's not about the things that we associate with a contemporary New York novel. But it is a New York novel because it's about ambition, and it's about the quest for success, and it's about how much New York loves success. I don't have particularly successful friends, however you want to define that term. I mean, everyone's sort of a shaggy dog, and that's what I like. But I do know people where, you go out to dinner parties and you sit down, and it's almost as if they're passing out their CVs. You go around the table and people start listing, what they do and so on and so forth. And it is a city where, because so many people who come there are a potent and sometimes toxic mix of terrifically ambitious and desperately insecure, it is a place where this idea of quantifiable success means much more and is fetishized much more than it is in any other city. So I wanted it to be a fairy tale in this sense as well, in that things do go well for these characters, that they do become successful. And it is able to help them in many ways. I mean, if someone had said to me, if Jude, hadn't made money, it would have been about health insurance. And it's right, the book would have, money makes life easier for him. And it also gives him an identity that has nothing to do with his past. It gives him solace in a lot of ways, professional success. But it doesn't mean everything. And I'm not going to say that, that money means nothing and it can't solve a whole host of problems, but ultimately it doesn't give him what he needs.
I have to say, I thought it was a New York novel out of the gate because it starts with real estate. Yeah. Looking for an apartment.
Yeah.
It's
It's
the 11th apartment that they've seen, the guy
Yeah.
across the way, and then there's so much discussion about, what the apartment means to Jude and Lispenard Street.
Right. But it's interesting. I mean, a lot of novels are about, I think particularly sort of fairy tale, novels that bridge fairy tales and contemporary naturalistic novels are about money. I mean, Austen of her time was someone who married a fairy tale with a contemporary naturalistic novel of the late 18th century, and those books were wildly about money. They were very clear-eyed and non-romantic about what money could do for you, what money could save you from, what money could allow for you, what kind of life money could spare you from. And so in that sense, although she wasn't someone I was thinking of directly, I think it is why I find why her novels have held up so well, because they are about they are fairy tales with a very sort of Susie Orman backbone. You know what I mean? It's this idea that you can have it, but first let's think practically.
Right. Well, and Jane Austen shows up in the Pennsylvania stint with Jude.
Yes.
Yeah, Emma.
Yeah, that's right.
I read your book. I thought it was fantastic, fabulous.
Thank you.
Tell us why you decided to write about 4 men as opposed to 4 women.
Well, I thank you for the question. I mean, I spent most of, I went to Smith. It was horrible, and then I went to book publishing, which is almost entirely staffed by women. And so, sort of from the ages of 17 through 22, when men are kind of at their most interesting, I didn't see any of them. They were elsewhere. And so when I finally did start seeing them, I was probably 25 or so when I went into magazine publishing. I was fascinated by them, and by their physicality and by what they could and couldn't say, how they expressed things, and more importantly, what they didn't express. And I really did think, like most writers think, of myself as an anthropologist. My first book was about a medical anthropologist. It was quite literally about anthropology. And it was about tribes. And in the way, I did start seeing men as their own sort of tribe. A group I could study, and a group with their own rituals and their own sort of codes and patterns of behavior. And so I think it would have been very different. Someone asked me recently, would this be the same book if it were about 4 female friends? And the answer is it would be about a third of the length, because, most of the time you're saying, well, just say it. And the truth is that there are certain things that men are not encouraged to say or to discuss, and they literally don't have language for it. I have a friend who's about 45 and has gone through some sort of trauma, I don't know what, and he cannot say it. And I think that, women, for better and for worse, and often the reasons behind this are for worse, have been taught to talk about trauma visited upon the body in a way that men have not.
Thanks. I did not read the book yet.
Did we spoil it for you?
Oh, no.
Okay, good.
You talked tonight a lot about visual images.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know if you could talk about visual images and words, and how the process of making visual images works.
That's a really good question. And the answer is, it's very unsatisfying to try to describe a piece of visual art. You never quite get it, because it's a completely different language altogether. It's like trying to describe sound or trying to describe taste. You can get sort of close, but it's a facsimile, not an actual representation, I suppose. And I think the trick, are you a writer yourself? You don't have to say, okay. I think the trick of it is that, or not the trick of it, but is not being too literal. With this book in particular, it was more about trying to recreate a mood rather than literally bring to life a particular image. And that is the way many of us do respond to visual art. We can respond to it as technicians or creators of it ourselves, but often what we are reacting to most is the inarticulable of emotion and what it actually makes us feel physically. And that's what I tried to do with this book, rather than lift the particular image and try to describe it on the page.
Hi, yes, I just want to congratulate you first off on your accolades.
Thank you.
Nominated accolades. Second off, who are some of the authors that you read? Perhaps that's a bit
well, I love Ishiguro. He's probably my favorite contemporary writer. And just because I love how he has sort of one theme in all of his books, memory, and the way that we answer memory and the tricks memory plays on us. And with every single book, he does a completely different novel. It's different in genre, it's different in scope, it's different in style, and that's very hard to do. I love Hilary Mantel because she's someone who changed styles completely in the middle of her career, which is also very hard to do. I love John Banville because he writes so beautifully. No one writes English more beautifully than he does. I love Peter Rock, who's a younger writer, and should be much better known. In particular, this book of his called My Abandonment. Jonathan Coe, who is a British satirist who isn't as known here as he is in the UK, but is by this gentleman, and is really is very, very funny, and the books are very, very sad as well. And Peter Cameron, who again, I like these. I've been drawn to books that are strange, and there's a particular book by Peter Cameron's called Coral Glyn, and you read it, and it starts off sort of like an English drawing room book, and then it becomes a sort of like Morris, like an E.M. Forrester type of book about gay identity in the post-World War II years. And then it becomes something uncategorizable. It's a very odd book, so I really love that. What else? I was just going to name somebody else too, and now I can't remember. I mean, I love Anita Bruckner, who's very unfashionable to love, but I do love her. And who else? God, whenever anyone asks me this, ideas just start fleeing my mind. But those are some of the people who I turn to constantly. Oh, and I love Stephen Milhauser, who writes these strange, magical short stories and novels. And they're not magical realism. They're just, but there's something, he describes things so well. This is someone who describes imagery very, very well. And they're these kind of haunted small kingdoms of stories. So I love his work as well.
Hi, I wanted to say thank
Hi.
you for the book. Hi.
Oh, thank you. Hi.
So I don't know if you can answer my question, but I'm hoping you can. I have gotten so absorbed by these characters that I cannot let go of the story or kind of get them out of my head, out of my dreams. I'm now listening to it on Audible. And I was thinking what you were talking about is submerging yourself in this story and in their lives. How do you move past that as, in your life and kind of move past these characters that you've spent so much time with?
I mean, that's a wonderful question. If you figure out the answer, let me know. I mean, I don't know. And, I don't know. And we're talking, if there is a film adaptation, then it's going to be another, 2 years of it. So I really don't know. I'm hoping that, time will just they'll just get bored and drift away and go bother you or something.
I figure it's got to be an opera.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah, just if I'm imagining Todd Hayes directing, it's at the Met. Scott Rudin buys it. It's got to be in Italian though. I don't think it'll fly in English.
Yeah.
Carry the weight of the emotion.
Yeah, you're right. English doesn't quite hack it, does it?
I'm totally fanboying out. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. That's kind of you.
I wonder whether you might say something about the intensity that you've produced. What's it like to produce not only an intense work, but intense conversations and intensity in readers who might not sleep for 3 days as they finish the book, readers who think about what they might do to certain reviewers to avenge you.
Philly.
That's very kind of you. So you don't have to worry about the reviewers because I don't read reviews. So I'm sort of in a cloud of ignorance. And the people who reach out are nice and they're not mean. But thank you. But you can just go rogue and do whatever you want. But it has been, it's been a great surprise. When I turned in this book, I remember telling my editor that it was very much a book that I wrote for me and my best friend, and that was it. And I sort of thought it might find a few hundred readers who felt really passionately about it, who felt that this book was speaking directly to them, and it felt like a secret to them. And what I told my editor is I wanted it to feel like something that you dug out from under a tree, and it was a magical object. And for everyone else, they wouldn't see it. But for the few hundred people who did, that it would feel like it said something about life that they didn't know that they wanted to say. And that would have been perfectly fine, and I would have been overjoyed with that. So, I think that this is the sort of book that, I wrote because, and I told my editor, it felt like an urgent book to me. It felt like everything I wanted to say about love and friendship and salvation or lack of it. And in that sense, it was a highly personal book. And because of that, when you write a book like that, you kind of don't know what's going to happen, and you don't go in with any expectations. And when people do respond to it, there is something sort of electric and intimate about that, because you think, okay, well, I wrote this book to feel, in part because I was feeling X, and someone else out there is feeling it as well. And it is, but it certainly wasn't conscious. I don't think anyone sits down and says, I'm going to write a book that, because I'm lonely and other people are going to feel equally lonely and recognize something of that loneliness. Everyone does it perhaps subconsciously, but no one does it consciously. So it's been a great shock, and continues to be a surprise. But it's thrilling. It's thrilling when anyone reads your book, and it's thrilling when anyone reacts to your book. And you kind of, if the reaction is bad or the reaction is good, you at least want them to react. How many novels have you read where you just finish it and shrug? And I knew that this wouldn't be that. I knew that if you read it, you would feel one way or another about it. And I never wanted it to be a book in which you just said, well, I don't really have an opinion about it. So the fact that so many people have been so gracious and generous, and have engaged with this book in the way that I hoped but didn't really expect, has been overwhelming. So thank you.
So I have a very simple question. I was just curious if, in figuring out the dose of catastrophe that you wanted to use, if you struggled at all to not save Jude throughout the story.
No, because I feel that the book remains true to itself all the way through, and that is something that I didn't struggle with. And of course, as a writer, you become attached to your characters, or you should, even the ones who aren't particularly, who are less sort of lovable than others. But in the end, the worst disservice you do to a book and to the reader as well is by shying away from what you have constructed to be inevitable, if that makes sense, without giving away too much.
Yeah, I also really, really like the book. The installments, we get sort of all these installments about Jude's past, and I'm wondering if you wrote those sections at the same time and then sort of spliced them, or if you wrote the book sort of front to back.
That's a good question. I wrote it front to back, but I knew where they were going to come in, and the structure is very clear to me, and it is the thing I think I'm probably strongest at is structure, and this is purely from being a magazine editor, because the first thing you're taught in magazine editing is how to make a piece move at the right clip, and so you just, everything else comes later. And reporting, but so before I began, I knew exactly how it was going to unfurl and at what pace.
You even had you planned in Harold's letters?
Yes.
Really, from the get-go?
Yeah.
Okay. Right in front here. No, I believe you.
Hi. I'm nervous kind of to talk, but anyway, I just want to tell you I loved the book.
Thank you so much.
I was so absorbed by it. It took me a few hundred pages to get into it, but once I was hooked, I was so completely enthralled by it. And I loved the way there was no real description, and it was like a timeless New York with a lot of characters that, as you read it, you quickly saw at the forefront was the relationship between Jude and Wilhelm, and the love between them, and the way that developed, I loved that. And the way Harold played in as a surrogate and how he reacted to that. And then I was thinking there's not many women in the book that and mentioned,
right.
And Julia became almost like, I don't know, maybe a character or something, and I figured that was intentional, and I thought that was good because everybody faded in the background except Jude and Wilhelm, and I couldn't stop thinking about it for days. It was like I was living, I couldn't read anything else after that, and I still can't find a book I like.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
First,
Hi.
Thank you for writing this book.
Oh, thank you so much.
So this is a book with four main characters that all have some shade of queerness going on. But what I noticed in the book is that queerness is often separate from love,
right.
Particularly between Willem and Jude. And I'm wondering if that is a direct response to the abuse that Jude had, and the only way that he could find love is through a non-sexual love.
That's a really wonderful question. I mean, I have been interested, I haven't read the Garth Greenwell piece in The Atlantic, but I know about it. And I thought it was a fantastic reading of the book. And so this is a piece in The Atlantic in which a very talented writer named Garth Greenwell called it a gay novel. And it wasn't a reading I had expected or intended, and I was honored that he did. And I intended the book. These are characters who really struggle against being labeled or named in any way, and I really thought of it as a male romance, but not necessarily a gay love story. And I think that what's been fascinating is that in the years. I started writing this in 2011, and it was published in 2015. And in that 4-year period, the discussion that we've had as a culture about gender fluidity, about what it means, about how you declare your sexuality, about how things are no longer as binary, has become much louder and richer and deeper than it was when I began. And so it's been interesting watching sort of older self-identified gay men and younger self-identified queer men read this book and see different books in it and see different, the older men are much more interested in saying, well, what is this relationship? Is it a gay relationship? Is he a character who is straight and becomes gay? And the younger ones see it as a romance. It's a romance between two men that has sex in it and then doesn't. But I do think for many men, for women, if you're an identified straight woman, and you have a relationship with another woman, and you continue to call yourself straight, no one will ever question you. If you're a man and that happens, you're gay, right? So I do think that for men, it's also, we allow men much less sort of nuance in the way that they express love, and the way they express romance, and the way they express sex. And sometimes those three things line up, and sometimes they don't. And one of the things that these characters struggle with is having a kind of relationship that doesn't fit within perhaps what they see reflected in popular culture or even around them. And what does that relationship look like? I wanted it to feel like a singular relationship to them. But also, I suppose, as a reminder that, romance or love takes many, many different forms and dips into many, many different categories of recognized relationships, I should say.
So as a ode to the intensity of your book, I read myself into a 2-day migraine, so thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
And my question is really around Malcolm, because I sort of felt that he was the least known to me, and I wanted to understand his pivotal role. A lot surrounded his profession, because he provided those very essential places of home.
Right.
And I felt that very strongly. And I guess I also felt that I questioned the outcome for him, and I don't want to give that away, but was there a sense of a very visceral balance that had to happen for you?
No, not necessarily. I mean, with Malcolm, I think that I also wanted the book to sort of echo how a friendship, a long-term friendship, changes and morphs over a lifetime. And I think there are all people who we think of fondly, and they were once very close to us, and we still consider them central to our identity, to our self, to our senses of self, but we just simply don't see them as often. And that particularly happens, of course, with friends from college and friends that you've known over decades, that you have these people who drift out and drift in. And I wanted to give a sense of that drift, that he was someone who had been imprinted upon them in ways, but simply wasn't around as much. And in terms of of what happens to him, again, this is such an unsatisfying answer, but I just sort of knew it.
Well, I think for those of us who've read this book, we know it's a great book. Thank you, Hanya Yanagihara.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Andy.